day for the NASA outfit here in Narok, Sophia.
All right, Murimi Mwangi there for us. Let's get into a conversation here in studio. Joining me on my immediate right is Michael Orwa, who's Democratic Governance Professional Society for International Development, as well as Dismas Mukua, who's a political risk analyst. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. 39 days to go to the election date. Are you surprised by how things are moving and how so much is still unresolved, and as far as the matters we still have in court?
Well, you know, when you compare this electoral cycle with what happened the previous years, one gets the impression that it seems like the environment doesn't seem to be very active. It seems to be very dry. But the two significant events, in my view, were the launches of the two manifestos by the two political parties. Now, when you look at the one for Jubilee, obviously there was a lot of color. It was actually, in my view, a best practice on how to run an event in Kenya, but it was lacking in content. One would easily say the environment created in the Jubilee launch was like a wedding. But when you go to NASA, it was like they were in a funeral. There was no color. It was very dull, but it was overflowing with content. And maybe the question now we need to start asking ourselves, do these really manifestos matter in Kenya? Because again, when you look at them carefully, there's really no difference between the Jubilee manifesto and the NASA manifesto. All of them are the same thing. And I think they were probably put together by one person. So all they need to do is to cut and paste. But at the end of the day, one begins to wonder really whether these manifestos are a cumulative reflection of the wishes of Wanjiku in Kenya. Because at the end of the day, really, what the voter in Kenya wants is that at the end of the day, the cost of living is reduced or you increase their disposable incomes. And I think that's what it boils down to. And unfortunately in Kenya, right now, all the rallies we are going to be having today, it will be NASA speaking to Wanjiku, it will be Jubilee speaking to Wanjiku, and we don't have the opportunity to give them feedback, assuming that there are a few Kenyans who have gone through the manifesto. President Kenyatta will not give the voters the opportunity to ask him a question, and Raila Odinga will not do the same thing. So we are left at a loss. So every 5 years, we are given a set of promises. Nobody cares whether or not they've been fulfilled. Another 5 years, again, another set of promises. And it seems to me that Wanjiku is left all alone.
Yeah. Michael, were you disappointed or were your expectations met by Jubilee? They had a manifesto, of course, coming into power. Here they were launching another manifesto. Is this also standard practice in other democracies that after you're in power, do you come back with a new manifesto or do you come back and first checklist on what you promised and perhaps then build from there?
Thank you, Sophia. I think that's a great question, actually, how you put it, because the main difference between, you've said a funeral versus a wedding, that's an interesting way to put it. But I think from a democratic development perspective, you know, we have a democracy that is young, it's got a lot of prospects, we've got a lot of ground to cover. So I think as a practice in itself, the fact that political parties, and I think not just the two main political parties or formations, I think we must encourage as many political parties and aspirants as possible to try to think about what is it that they're bringing to the citizens. Yeah. But what you've said is really important, is that the difference between Jubilee, even if both manifestos were the same, the major difference between Jubilee as an incumbent government and the opposition is that the Jubilee has to start from a point of saying, this is what we committed 3-5 years ago. This is our report card. This is what we think we've done, and this is where we've exceeded expectations. This is what we have not done, and this is why we have not done this. Given these circumstances, we are asking you to give us a new mandate, one, to complete what we haven't, with the reasons we've given, assuming they are convincing enough, and then in addition to this, another 5 years would mean an expansion of this vision in this context. Jubilee did not do that. For ODM, NASA, or the opposition, the main opposition, it's always to start from the perspective of a marking scheme. What have they done? What did they promise? They've not delivered, or they have delivered, and this is where we are different from them. I don't think we have reached a level where there's serious thought on what manifestos mean or should mean. Number one, I think they are not as participatory as they should be. And Disma said, you know, there's no space where there will be an opportunity for people to ask Honorable Raila Odinga or Uhuru Kenyatta, whether in a campaign trail or in an organized space with professionals and ordinary citizens, that you plan to build road X from point A to B. How did you arrive at this? And how does this compare with the priority of digging water, boreholes, and getting us water for us? So there's no that space. I think where we need to go to is to really encourage political parties, formations, to be as participatory as possible, take the benefit of opinion polls that have been done maybe the last 3 years and say, you know, in 2017, for example, there was a wish list in an Ipsos survey of what Kenyans would want to see in 2017 and what Kenyans would want to see in political parties' manifestos. Therefore, then our question becomes, to what extent are political manifestos responsive positively to the dreams and aspirations of Kenyans?
Yeah, and this was, you know, you talked about them being pretty much the same, the manifestos. But did you feel it was also a rehashing of the same things? I mean, the issues are largely similar. You have security, you have food, health, all of those are key and important. But was there anything that stood out in as far as either a newness in idea of approach of an issue, or is it the same rehash?
No, when you look at those two manifestos, all of them are anchored on Vision 2030 and the Kenyan Constitution. Because I think that's where everything that we're supposed to do as a nation flows from. And anybody who is coming up with a manifesto which is not consistent with Vision 2030 and the Kenyan Constitution, then there's a very high chance that people will start yawning. And I think the difference now would be on the priorities. What are the priorities for Jubilee and what are the priorities for NASA? And what one would have expected, borrowing from best practices like in the UK and the US, a political party will have several meetings to agree that these are our priorities. This is what we propose to when you take office. And the Constitution is very clear on that, public participation. But unfortunately in Kenya, our politicians, when they get elected, they assume that all of a sudden they are clever and they know the issues affecting us. For instance, if say you want to come up with an agenda, say in Kisii, the priority in Kisii may not be water. The priority could actually be roads. And then you say, I'm giving you a water project. The people in Kisii are not worried about water. Maybe they're worried about roads. And then because you get a group of political party elites for both Jubilee and NASA, that the guys who sit in a 5-star hotel and come up with a manifesto and say this is what we are running with. But what stands out from Jubilee and the manifesto is very clear. And even when you look at President Kenyatta, it's about his development agenda. In a nutshell, when you analyze Jubilee and Kenyatta, if Kenyatta says, I'm going to deliver a road somewhere, it's very easy to believe him. And you don't even need to start questioning whether or not he's going to deliver. The only question people start asking, what is going to be the cost of that project? Like, for instance, the now infamous bridge in Sigiri that collapsed. So those are the questions asked. And when you look at NASA, when Raila Odinga is speaking and NASA is believing, you believe that he's actually going to fight corruption and there's going to be a bit of inclusivity. Because when you look at the theme of NASA, it's all about inclusivity. Because people have accused Jubilee of failing to capture the face and aspiration of Kenya. That when you look at the cabinet, when you look at the formation of the government, is it actually consistent with Article 10 of the Kenyan Constitution? It's all, people say that it's all about tribalism, and that's what Kenyatta is accused of. While on the other hand, Jubilee says, look at these from the makeup of NASA. They've been in government for a cumulative of 100 years. What do they have to show? And when you go through the argument with a lot of detail, you realize there's actually nobody within NASA who's been president. And you know the buck stops with him. And again, there's this fallacy that we are beginning to have today about governors, like for especially in Machakos. The governor says that now people are having the opportunity to get water because I'm now the governor. In the past, where have you used your money? And he forgets this is the first time we're having devolution. Because in the past, in as much as Kalonzo was the Kamba kingpin, he did not have resources to do these projects. But I think moving forward, for us as Kenyans, before you take a decision as to whether you're going to vote for Raila Odinga or President Kenyatta, you need to ask yourself as an individual, who best serves your aspiration? If in the next 5 years, say, for instance, if you stay in Kileleshwa and you want to move to Karen, you need to ask yourself, who between Raila Odinga and Kenyatta will assist me achieve that objective? When you identify your selfish interest, then now you'll start voting on issues. Because unfortunately, the case is today, if you're a low man from Bondom, whether Raila launches a manifesto or not, you're going to vote for him. If you're a Kikuyu man from Gatundu, it doesn't matter whether there's a manifesto. And you saw yesterday the way both reacted. President Kenyatta says, I've gone through that manifesto and I don't see anything convincing. And then on the other hand, Raila Odinga says, Jubilee is about to launch another manifesto because they've seen what we did last night. But when they're talking about manifestos, nowhere is the conversation focused on Wanjiko.
Yeah, it was interesting. We covered yesterday when Eldoret, and just listening to the residents there, actually some of those that were interviewed, majority of those interviewed were in support of the NASA manifesto, and they were very well in understanding of the issues in both manifestos. So would you say perhaps that is an indication of the electorate getting more conversant with the matters and the issues, and also perhaps that swing of vote, do you think?
I think, Sophia, the ground... I'm very optimistic about the promise of our democracy, and I'm happy to take the small incremental positives that come out of it in every 5 years of an election. I think the challenge of incumbency, especially an incumbency that has thrived on exclusion, and I wouldn't even say ethnic exclusion, because you could argue on one point that it's an ethnic exclusion of, it's a government of Kikuyus and Kalenjins. But I don't think it is true if you go a notch higher in that analysis. It's a government of 2 young men and families and their closest of associates who have basically plundered this country and given everybody else a walking ticket to march out if you don't agree with it. So, and I think what you're seeing, especially in Jubilee strongholds, is an intentionality on the side of citizens trying to figure out, by the way, beyond the global politics up there of I am Kikuyu, at the basic sense, there's no Kikuyu who gets a discount on unga or milk or water. Nobody asks you for your ID when you go to a petrol station to fuel your car. So ultimately, I think it might take a very long time, but people will start to realize, as you're saying, what is my selfish interest as a citizen, and who among these probably holds the likeliest promise of delivering on that. Having said that, I think it's premature to say whether really the citizens are shifting from one stronghold to another. But I think what is clear on that is that the incumbent government would have a significant challenge on 2 things. One, the question of inclusion and whether really tuko pamoja as a country, or pamoja as 2 human beings. Number 2 is the question of, I think they have failed dramatically as a ruling regime on the question of equality again, on question of gender. And I wish either of the political formations spoke about an ambition of 50-50 representation, not just in terms of elections, but now appointive positions where you don't need parliament, for example. President Kenyatta could have actually decided with Uhuru, with Ruto in their cabinet and in their ambassadors and in all the other appointive positions, which cumulatively are actually more than elected. And to say we are committed to looking for, because if you map out this country, there are an amazing number of super qualified women, Kenyan women, even outside of this country. So if I have a political commitment to actually meet the gender 2/3, I'll actually meet gender 50-50. So they have failed in that. I've not seen that level of ambition. Finally, on the question of corruption, and to their credit, I don't think Jubilee manifesto or the leadership even wanted to have a conversation around corruption, because there's little they can say in that space. So they've basically spoken about taking care of resources, everything else except the word that will fight corruption, either because of the shoddy record, and I think we've seen 4 years of basically state-led corruption. It's driven by the state and the people within the state. So they have lost that conversation. So whether NASA can or can't is a question you can only judge when NASA is in power. And I think there's something important you said, that it's difficult to, whether you can say cumulatively NASA have been in power for 100 years. It's a great argument for the podium. But I think executive power rests with the president, with substantive power.
All right. So let's talk about how Kenyans can hold these leaders to account, and how do they go about doing that? And even this promise is realistic. You hear about pulling out, say, for example, of KDF from Somalia within a 90-day period. They're not talking about the proverbial 100 days, it's 90 days now. Are they realistic, and how does Wanjiko hold them to account?
Well, some of the promises are very realistic, which require administrative actions. Like, for instance, when NASA says, if we take over, there's going to be free secondary education, it's going to be very easy. Assuming that Raila wins and becomes the president, as soon as the parliament has been summoned, if he commands majority in the two houses, he can call for a supplementary budget. And I think the amount they're talking about is about 60 billion. So it's not very hard to get 60 billion if you've got a majority in the two houses. And you look at the non-priority areas in their view, then you allocate the budget. That one is easy. But the
if
ones,
you get a majority, if you don't, you have a nightmare.
If you don't, you have got a nightmare. And maybe that's the reason why the president and his deputy need to listen to the voice of the people in the villages. Because they're saying, we are not very keen on this thing called six-piece. Allow us to take the decisions on our own. Like, for instance, President Kenyatta yesterday had a very tricky day in Kirinyaga. I mean, the fellow had to take a decision. You also recall Raila Odinga had a situation in Rarieda, and also Kalonzo is having a situation in Kitui. Maybe what they need to do is let the people decide, the way Matiba would say. And when they get to the National Assembly and the Senate, then it would be easy to cut a deal. Like, for instance, if Kembe Gitura becomes the senator from Muranga, and you've been proactively campaigning against him, now when he gets to the Senate, he may decide to take an entirely different view, because he knows for a fact that you are not going to fire him for the next 5 years. But I think, Sophia, in my view, the big issue that Kenyans need to ask ourselves is to start running away from voting as a tribal bloc. There are a low man in Kisumu who reads the Jubilee manifesto and is happy with it, should be able to go and vote for President Kenyatta without feeling guilty that he's betrayed his tribe. And we now go back to that conversation of family and friends. And Michael here has raised the issue. When you talk about corruption, it's not as if it's the entire Kikuyu community which is corrupt, or the entire Kalenjin community which is corrupt. Because when you go to the Auditor General's report, it points out specific names.
Who is?
Yeah, specific names. It doesn't say this community went to a fair house and, opportunities meant for the marginalized people were taken to an entire community. When you start picking out those names, then you discover that you'll actually be able to address your selfish interest. Because when Wanjiku is selling vegetables, say at Kibera Market, for Wanjiku, she doesn't care who's coming to buy our wares. She's struggling to make her sell on that particular day because now she has to literally dodge bullets from the county government of Nairobi. Maybe she doesn't have a license. She fears that if she falls sick, she goes to the hospital, she may not get the right kind of medical attention. And for her, I don't think it matters whether it's Raila Odinga who is the president or it's Kenyatta, provided you deliver. And when we get to that space, Kenya will be a very good country. Now, when you're talking about accountability, you've seen that in some counties like Nandi, the people are so disappointed with the county government and all the MCAs were sent home. And also the same situation is obtaining in Nyeri. Yeah, most of the sitting MPs have been told to take a walk. Now, some of the voters are so powerful and very, furious. They are saying that you've been stealing our money. Where I come from, the people elected as MCAs, 5 years ago, they wouldn't be able to afford a cup of tea in a five-star hotel in Nairobi. But when they come to Nairobi now, they come with a delegation. An MCA comes with a delegation of about 10 guys, and now they're staying at the Intercontinental Hotel. So you begin to wonder, these guys, what factors of production have they been able to put together to harness to become millionaires all of a sudden?
And to themselves.
Yeah. And also, there was a conversation which all over has gone down. Because, NASA was saying that the deputy president has become so rich all of a sudden that he's able to donate money to meetings and funerals on short notice. Those are the questions, in my view, we need to start asking. When we are told that it's family and friends who are beneficiaries of this corruption, how do we unveil that the mask and then we can actually point fingers? Because, like today I've seen an advert in the newspaper that Kalonzo is having a fundraising somewhere. That people are going to rush to those meetings and give a check. Actually, when you look at the invite, people have been told, come with your banking slip and the invitation card. Now, if Kalonzo was interested in transparency, he would actually display those banking slips so that we know who is supporting his campaign. Because, we are told for a fact there is no free lunch. If you're giving money to Jubilee or you're giving money to NASA, you're expecting something in return. And I think the challenge is, especially to President Kenyatta, they had a big dinner at Safari Park Hotel and understand it was who is who in society. In the interest of transparency, they need to come out and give us the names. It's only at that stage that we'll believe that, in fact, there is a bit of transparency in the operation. And that's why NASA wins on the war. Because the reason why people, even in Eldoret, would like to vote for NASA, I don't think it's much because of the manifesto. Believe you me, there are very few Kenyans who read manifestos. Right now, if you look for 10 MPs, or rather 10 candidates for MP in NASA, and you want to discuss a chapter in that manifesto, they've not seen it.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
All right. And Michael, your thoughts? Yes.
Sophia, there was something around accountability, and I think it piggybacks well from where Dismas has left. And you asked the question of, for manifestos to matter, I think part of what we are doing and what we are seeing within the media is also this public discussion about are there differences, what does this mean and stuff. And it's not to encourage laziness. We have to encourage citizens to engage and interact with manifestos. But from an accountability perspective, I think we have multiple stakeholders. We have citizen groups, we have non-profit actors, NGOs, civil society, faith communities, we have the media. I think post-election, it's important for us to send the signal to political parties, one, that though it was not a participatory practice, we take your word seriously in these manifestos. And therefore, we want to hold you accountable to the promises you made. I'll give you a case we did with the Society for International Development on the Jubilee promises on anti-corruption in the last election. And we picked essentially what they had said about the agenda for fighting corruption in this country and gave a marking scheme, graded them based on that, whether it was achieved, not achieved, it had worsened, it was better. And we had a conversation with them. And when you said we are doing a corruption or integrity report card, at first people say this is a criticism, this is a kind of a campaign, but it wasn't. Because we were basically saying, Sophia, you came to us and asked us to give you a job. And you promised us these 10 things. We want to have a conversation with you about the extent where you've reached and stuff. And for me, that is the participatory and accountability mechanism we must build post-election. That we must not